They often say that history begins where memory ends. But what if our collective memory ended far earlier than anyone dares to admit? In the dim quiet of ancient Mesopotamia, long before cities rose like constellations on the earth, there lingers a fracture, an absence so complete it almost feels intentional. It appears not as a clean break, but as a faint tearing, the way old papyrus disintegrates at its weakest seam. And in that seam, the Sumerians left words that seemed too heavy, too knowing, too ancient for a civilization supposedly just stepping into the world for the first time. That contradiction has haunted anyone who reads their earliest inscriptions. It is as if they're speaking with a voice borrowed from someone else. Archaeologists once celebrated Sumer as the dawn of civilization. Writing, law, astronomy, mathematics, irrigation, cities, appearing abruptly like a sudden sunrise. But even in the earliest scholarly works, there is unease. Too much begins here, too quickly, too fully formed. No gradual experimentation, no crude prototypes, no stumbling attempts preceding mastery. Tablets found at Uruk describe complex numerical systems and celestial observations that would normally require centuries of trial and refinement. Yet they appear at the very start of the record, as though inherited rather than invented. That is where the first crack appears. The question of how a people with no known predecessors managed to behave like descendants of something older. Many researchers try to explain away the abruptness, climate change, population pressure, agricultural surplus. But these theories, while reasonable, do not smooth over the more puzzling details. A proto-writing system, fully capable of tracking astronomical cycles, emerges alongside monumental architecture aligned with cardinal directions. The earliest city plans show sophisticated zoning, granary distribution, and water management, almost as if someone had shown them the blueprint before the bricks were ever laid. Even the Sumerian language, an isolate with no known relatives, feels like a remnant that somehow slipped through time's sieve. Linguists have stared into that void for decades, searching for roots that never appear. And then there is the Sumerian king list, preserved in tablets scattered from Nippur to Lhasa. Its opening lines make scholars shift in their chairs. When kingship descended from heaven, a poetic line, they say, a metaphor, a ritual phrase. But beneath the surface, a persistent discomfort grows. Because after that line comes something harder to dismiss. It names 8 kings who ruled before a great flood, assigning them reigns lasting thousands of years, 241,200 years in total, depending on the manuscript. Historically impossible, of course, symbolic, say some, mythical, say others. But even those explanations feel like a curtain hastily pulled over a door not meant to be opened. Why encode myths in numbers that mimic precessional cycles? Why speak of a time before the flood as if it were a factual epoch, one as real to them as the rise of Uruk or the rule of Sargon? And why do these reigns shrink dramatically only after the flood, as though some boundary had truly been crossed? As the 20th century progressed, excavations at Eridu, the so-called first city, revealed something else unsettling. Beneath its visible remains lay layer upon layer of earlier construction, descending deep into the soil like the roots of a memory trying desperately not to be erased. Some levels belonged to cultures whose sophistication did not match the simplicity archaeologists expected. There were drainage systems where none should exist, fired clay objects made with unexpected precision, alignments that suggested someone understood solstice tracking long before urban life was supposed to allow such specialization. Each layer felt like a faint echo of something older than itself. Yet no one can point to the civilization that supposedly preceded Sumer. There is only a silence, a blank field of missing evidence. It is that silence, the absence itself, that begins to feel suspicious, as though someone erased not the ruins, but the world that produced them. Even Sumerian myths carry the tone of recollection rather than invention. They speak of knowledge restored, not created, of laws given back, not born for the first time, of cities rebuilt, not founded. They're gods, not youthful creators, but custodians of an inheritance. Scholars have debated for decades whether these textual nuances reflect theology, psychology, or something more literal. The preservation of a fading memory. Some have suggested that these tales represent the reconstitution of society after regional collapse, such as the end of the Ubaid period. Others propose that the myths encode geological events, the flooding of the Gulf, the shift of river courses, the transformation of landscapes. But even these interpretations cannot account for the eerie consistency of the Sumerian claim that they were remembering rather than inventing. The king list itself offers a strange clue. After detailing the impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings, the text casually inserts a line, "Then the flood swept over." And after the flood, the kingship appears again, shortened, humanized, fragmented, as if something severed the long thread that connected the past to the present, as if time itself were cleaved into before and after. That transition, restated in every surviving version, resembles trauma rather than myth-making. It reads like the aftermath of a reset. But why would a civilization encode such memories and yet leave no explicit explanation? Why speak of the flood as an event so decisive it redefined time, but never name its cause? Why preserve astronomical cycles with meticulous care while allowing their own origins to dissolve into metaphor? And why does it feel as if they expected someone in the future to notice the inconsistencies, to sense the missing layer beneath the visible story? Some scholars have proposed that the Sumerians were reconstructing history from partial remnants left by earlier cultures. Others argue that they preserved fragments of oral traditions stretching back into the late Pleistocene. A few fringe researchers speak of lost civilizations erased by natural catastrophe. Yet none of these explanations fully match the tone of the texts that sound less like speculation and more like regret, as if something once known had been taken from them, leaving only cryptic reminders. The earliest scribes wrote with a clarity that suggests they were not inventing tradition, but preserving it under pressure, like archivists copying the final pages of a book whose earlier chapters had already turned to dust. They seemed painfully aware that their world was not the first and perhaps not the last, and embedded in their myths, their numbers, their cities, there is a feeling, more sensed than understood, that they were signaling to the future, not to warn of gods, but of forgetting. Because if a civilization can emerge suddenly with knowledge it should not yet have, then the story of human origins is not a straight line. It is a rope with strands missing. The question is not what the Sumerians knew, but what they remembered, and whose memory it truly was. And so, as scholars continue to peel away the layers of clay and time, one question rises like a low hum beneath everything. If the Sumerians were only the inheritors, then who were the ones who came before? And why did they vanish so completely that only numbers and whispers remain? That question lingers, soft but persistent, as though waiting for the next fragment to surface from the dust. There is a place where the earth seems to remember more than the people who walk upon it, a quiet patch of ancient soil near the shoreline of the Persian Gulf, where the shifting sands and receding waters occasionally reveal something that feels older than history itself. They call it Eridu, the Fur City, if the Sumerians to be believed. Yet the more archaeologists study it, the more it behaves like a memory too old and too heavy to belong to the era in which it supposedly emerged. And that discomfort has never truly faded. The traces of this unease stretch back to the earliest excavations. Teams digging into Eridu expected to find the beginnings of a settlement, something crude and formative, a village learning how to be a city. Instead, they uncovered layer after layer of deliberate construction, each built upon the last like calm, methodical repetitions of an older blueprint. Some counted 18 layers. Others argued for deeper, older phases whose outlines blur into the geological substrate itself. It is as though the city rose and fell repeatedly before recorded time even began, each iteration preserving the ghost of an earlier pattern. Scholars tried to explain these layers in simple terms: ritual rebuilding, gradual expansion, seasonal shifts. But the precision complicates that story. The earliest phases of Eridu already display an unexpected sophistication: structured water channels, compacted floors, deliberate orientation toward the cardinal directions. These are not the marks of wandering herders testing the foundations of urban life. They look more like attempts to maintain something whose origins were already slipping away. And then there is the Temple of Enki, the horizon point of Eridu. Its earliest forms appear too ordered, too geometrically deliberate for a culture supposedly just transitioning from tribal life. The sequence of rebuildings follows a consistent plan, like someone remembering a shape rather than inventing one. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more they feel as though they're chasing the shadow of a template that predates even the earliest bricks. Each stratum suggests that the Sumerians were not creating a sacred space from nothing, but reconstructing one whose meaning they did not fully grasp. The myths surrounding Eridu echo this feeling. Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and creation, does not bring knowledge into the world as a brand new gift. Instead, he restores the decrees of civilization, as though retrieving them from an earlier epoch. The language carries the strange mood of rediscovery, not invention. Even in the Eridu Genesis tablet, the earliest creation myth from Mesopotamia, the tone is not one of Genesis but of repair. Humanity is fashioned not as a new idea but as a necessary continuation, as if the world was being put back together after some immense loss. And that loss seems to hover in the archaeological record. Ubaid culture, which predates the Sumerians and whose traces lie beneath Eridu's earliest levels, presents its own mystery. Their tools, ceramics, and figurines show a serenity and refinement that do not entirely match the narrative of the people, merely preparing the ground for later brilliance. There are figurines carved with elongated heads, odd postures, and meticulously incised patterns. Some scholars dismiss them as artistic convention. Others sense a fading memory encoded into clay. But what unsettles most researchers is not the figurines themselves. It is the disappearance of the Ubaid culture without explanation. They fade from the record, and the Sumerians rise soon after with knowledge far too advanced for an abrupt emergence. Because of this, some scholars propose a continuity, that the Sumerians inherited a foundation from the Ubaid. But then the same question returns: where did the Ubaid acquire their refinement? Why is their origin also veiled? Why does every attempt to push history backward lead to another silence? Eridu sits at the heart of this silence like a riddle. Geological studies suggest that the shoreline of the Persian Gulf once lay far inland, meaning whole landscapes mentioned in ancient myths might now hide beneath the shallow waters. Sediment cores taken offshore show evidence of ancient freshwater channels now submerged, hinting at the possibility that settlements, or even early cultural centers, once stood where the sea now gently laps. If that is true, then parts of the earliest story of civilization lie drowned beyond reach, sealed beneath layers of silt. And yet the Sumerians themselves consistently pointed to Eridu as the place where kingship descended, even before the rise of dynasties. They repeatedly returned to the city as the beginning of order, law, and structured society. Why Eridu? Why this particular patch of land? Why speak of it as though it occupied a role far older and far weightier than archaeology comfortably allows? There is a tone, quiet, almost mournful in these references, as though recalling a memory they could not fully articulate. One small fragment found in the debris of Nippur only deepens the enigma. It describes a time when the boundaries were lost, when the old places were swallowed. Scholars debate whether the lines refer to myth or metaphor, but the text's imagery aligns eerily with geological evidence of rapid flooding events in the Gulf region during the late Holocene. Was this fragment a poetic lament, or the distant echo of lived experience, of settlements submerged, of migrations forced by rising waters, of memories preserved only in the form of ritual rebuilding. Some researchers have suggested that Eridu's earliest levels represent not the first construction of a city, but the re-establishment of one after a significant environmental shift, perhaps even after the flooding of what is now the Gulf Basin. If true, then Eridu may not be the birthplace of civilization, but the refuge of its survivors. That possibility would explain its overwhelming symbolic weight in Sumerian tradition. It would also explain why its earliest architecture already feels like a repetition rather than a beginning. But this hypothesis introduces a troubling implication. If Eridu was built as a remembrance, then what exactly were they remembering? And why does every attempt to trace that memory backward lead only to erasure, whether by water, by time, or by the strangely coordinated silence of the archaeological record? The further scholars push into Eridu's deep layers, the more they encounter the sensation that the city is not telling the whole story. Its stratigraphy behaves less like the start of a civilization, and more like the final appearance of something migrating through time, losing clarity with every repetition. And the Sumerians themselves in their texts seem aware of this. They speak of origins that feel recovered rather than invented, of rituals that feel inherited rather than newly formed. Perhaps that is why Eridu feels so haunting. It is a place where the earth holds the memory of something older than the civilization that claims it. A place built upon earlier shapes whose outlines have blurred into myth. A reminder that the beginning we see may not be the first chapter, but merely the earliest page that survived. And as the foundations of Eridu continue to erode under the slow wear of sun and wind, one question refuses to fade. If this was the city they rebuilt, then where was the one they lost? And what truth was buried when the shoreline swallowed its name? There is a peculiar heaviness in the way ancient scribes pressed their styluses into wet clay when they wrote the Sumerian king list, as though the act itself carried an obligation they could not ignore. The list should have been straightforward, names, reigns, genealogies, but instead it reads like a memory that refuses to behave, stretching across epochs that defy everything we understand about human time. The further one reads into it, the more it feels like brushing against the edge of a story half remembered, half erased, and perhaps purposefully obscured. At its surface, the king list is a political document, a record of rulers intended to legitimize dynasties, yet its opening section defies that purpose completely. It begins not with modest settlements or modest figures, but with 8 kings whose reigns spanned tens of thousands of years. Alulima Eridu, 28th around 800 years. Alelangar, 36,000. Edsmenlawana, 43,200. The numbers stack like impossible staircases, climbing into spans that no human body could endure. Traditional historians dismiss these as symbolic, metaphoric markers of mythic time, and yet the list consistently places these kings in real cities: Eridu, Bagtabira, Larak, Shurupak, places that archaeologists have physically excavated. That is where the tension lies: mythic durations embedded in concrete geography. If these were purely symbolic inventions, why anchor them so firmly in places that the ancient audience recognizably inhabited? Why insist that kingship descended in specific cities? Why give detailed succession patterns linking one impossibly long reign to the next? The consistency of these details across many tablet copies suggests deliberate preservation, not creative embellishment. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobson attempted to interpret the long reigns through numerology, arguing that the durations reflect base 60 calculations, astronomical cycles, or mythic structures. But even he admitted that certain patterns resist symbolic interpretation. The numbers in the antediluvian section follow a distinct rhythm. They decrease slightly, then increase again, and fall sharply. They do not mirror lunar cycles or solar precession with the tidy precision symbolic explanations demand. They behave more like decayed records, distorted over time but not invented from scratch. Other researchers suggest that the massive reign lengths compress oral traditions from earlier eras, Leaders whose names persisted through multiple generations, merged into single figures through mnemonic collapse. A reasonable idea, perhaps. But it does not explain why the duration shrinks so dramatically after the flood. Why would oral tradition maintain enormous spans before the flood and suddenly become meticulously realistic afterward? Something about that shift carries the tone of trauma, as if recounting history before the flood required a different language, one stretched by memory's distortion, while recounting after the flood required precision, as though the world itself had tightened. There is another strange detail. Every surviving version of the king list insists that the flood marks a boundary, not just in time, but in the nature of kingship. Before the flood, kingship is singular, centralized, unbroken. After the flood, it becomes fragmented. Dynasties rise and fall swiftly. Cities compete for authority. Lifespans shorten. The language shifts from expansiveness to containment. It reads as though something essential was lost, some stabilizing force, some continuity, leaving the world weaker and more divided. This pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia. Comparative mythologists note similar transitions in ancient Egyptian, Vedic, and early Greek traditions. A golden age marked by incredibly long-lived rulers or sages, followed by a catastrophic disruption, and then a new diminished era. In Egypt, the followers of Horus appear as semi-divine rulers predating the first dynasties, with reigns lasting centuries. In India, the concept of yugas describes earlier ages where human lifespan and consciousness were vastly different. Even Plato hints at cycles of destruction and rebirth, with Atlantis representing a pre-cataclysmic civilization. It is not the literal truth of these accounts that matters, but the shared structural memory, the sense that something before recorded history was fundamentally different, and that a rupture split the world into before and after. The Sumerian king list is simply the most explicit version of this recurring motif, preserving it not in mythic poetry, but in administrative prose, as if daring future generations to question why their history begins at the point where another seems to have ended. But what if the long reigns are not meant to be interpreted literally at all? Some historians propose that the numbers encode accumulated knowledge rather than biological lifespan. In this view, a king could represent a lineage, a cultic office, or a repository of tradition. The vast durations would reflect the length of time a cultural system persisted, rather than the life of a single individual. This theory, though elegant, leads to yet another troubling implication. If the antediluvian kings represent cultural systems maintained across tens of thousands of years, then humanity had some form of organized society long before archaeology currently acknowledges. That possibility unsettles even the most cautious scholars. The earliest known cities appear around 6,000 years ago. Organized religion, agriculture, and writing emerge gradually before that. To suggest that structured cultural systems existed tens of thousands of years earlier demands a rethinking of everything, from human migration patterns to the cognitive evolution of our species. And yet, the king list sits there, quietly insisting that memory stretches back further than we want to believe. The most radical interpretations, of course, propose that the antediluvian kings reflect a lost civilization, one erased by the very flood the Sumerians described. These theories are often met with skepticism, but their persistence hints at something deeper, a discomfort with the idea that human history might be discontinuous, punctuated by destruction and forgetting. The king list, whether intentionally or not, embodies this possibility, holding the outline of a past too large to fit neatly within our current archaeological models. Even within mainstream academia, hints of all the complexity occasionally surface. Excavations at sites like Göbekli Tepe push organized ritual life back to 10,000 BCE. The genetic record reveals population bottlenecks around cataclysmic climatic events. Sediment cores from regions surrounding Mesopotamia show abrupt flooding episodes and environmental instability near the end of the Pleistocene. And yet, despite these clues, no civilization that could match the grandeur implied in the king list has been uncovered. Some scholars suspect Eurasia, natural or otherwise. Others believe the long rains represent mythologized echoes of a deeper past, but no one denies that the document feels strange, as if written with the weight of an ancient burden. The scribes copied it faithfully through centuries, never altering the rain lengths, never simplifying the structure. They preserved the impossible numbers with almost reverential obedience, as though they feared losing something essential if they trimmed even a single year. One of the most intriguing fragments comes from the Well-Blundell prism, where the transition between the antediluvian and post-diluvian eras is marked by a simple phrase: kingship was carried to Kish. That verb, carried, suggests more than political relocation. It hints at preservation, intentionality, rescue, as if something vital survived the flood, passed on to the world that emerged afterward. Something delicate enough to be carried, yet powerful enough to reshape the future. What was it? A lineage? A ritual? A fragment of knowledge? Or merely the memory of a world washed away? No one can answer. But the shadow of the question stretches long across the clay, and as researchers continue to decode the king list, its strangeness becomes not a flaw but a signal, a reminder that history as written may be only the thin crust overlying a deeper, unbroken core of experience. The antediluvian kings, whether real or symbolic, represent humanity's uneasy dialogue with time, a negotiation between what was remembered and what was lost. And somewhere beneath those impossible numbers, one cannot shake the feeling that the Sumerians were trying to say something, not about the kings themselves, but about the silence that swallowed their world. A silence whose edges we are only beginning to notice. And if those edges are real, then what remains hidden within them, waiting to be uncovered, may reshape more than just timelines. It may force us to ask why the oldest stories warn not of a beginning, but of a forgetting. There are moments in the archaeological record when the earth seems to inhale sharply, as if remembering an event so immense that time itself rearranged around it. One such moment appears in the layers of silt, pollen, and shattered chronology that lie beneath the myths of Mesopotamia. A moment the Sumerians called simply the flood. Not a flood, but the flood. A singular rupture marking the boundary between worlds. Scholars treat it as myth, but the deeper one follows the evidence, the harder it becomes to dismiss the sense that something enormous, and perhaps global, stands behind the story. The Sumerians were never vague about the flood's significance. In that king list, it arrives like a blade, 8 long reigning kings, then a single line. Then the flood swept over. After that, everything is changed. Lifespans, politics, even the tone of their storytelling shifts sharply. It is as though memory before the flood belonged to a different kind of world, and everything after belonged to ours. But what event could fracture history so thoroughly that an entire civilization would treat it not as legend, but as the axis around which time turned? Archaeology offers clues, not perfect ones, not enough to give the story a single neat explanation, but enough to create a constellation of possibilities. One of the earliest archaeological attempts to locate the flood came in the 1920s, when Leonard Woolley dug into the ruins of Ur. Beneath layers of habitation, he discovered a deep, clean band of clay, evidence of a massive inundation. Woolley announced he had found the biblical and Sumerian flood. Newspapers celebrated, scholars argued. But later excavations complicated the story. Similar layers appeared in some cities, absent in others, and varied in depth and date. There was no single tidy flood that covered all Mesopotamia simultaneously. Yet the layers revealed something equally unsettling. Repeated episodes of destructive region-wide flooding across millennia, events large enough to erase towns, alter river courses, and sever lines of cultural memory. Still, none of these were global. None matched the magnitude of the event described in Mesopotamian myth. Then geologists looked beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. They found signs of massive meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age. Enormous surges of fresh water rushing into the oceans as glaciers collapsed. These pulses raised sea levels abruptly, by meters in some places, drowning coastlines and reshaping continents. Sediment cores from the Persian Gulf reveal that the basin, once a wide floodplain, transformed rapidly into a shallow sea around 8000 BCE, swallowing entire landscapes that may once have supported early settlements. If people lived there, and the presence of ancient river channels suggests they did, then their world would quite literally have disappeared beneath their feet. To those who survived, would it not feel like a flood sent by the gods? Meanwhile, another catastrophe unfolded thousands of kilometers away, the Black Sea Deluge. Around 5600 BCE, global sea level rise overtopped the Bosporus, causing the Mediterranean to cascade into the Black Sea basin with unimaginable force. The event flooded vast areas of inhabited land. Whether this event influenced Mesopotamian myth is debated, but the timing and impact echo too strongly to ignore. The earth was drowning its coasts. Humankind was retreating, confused, displaced. Then comes the most haunting possibility, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Around 12,800 years ago, something, perhaps fragments of a disintegrating comet, may have struck or exploded over parts of the northern hemisphere. Evidence is still contested. Some scientists argue for impact proxies, nanodiamonds, microspherules, high-temperature minerals, found in layers across North America, Greenland, and parts of the Near East. Others reject the interpretation. But even without an impact, the Younger Dryas was a period of sudden climate collapse. Temperatures plummeted, megafauna vanished, and entire ecosystems shifted violently within decades. If people carried ancestral memories of this upheaval into later millennia, could those memories fuse with stories of regional flooding to form the archetype of a single great deluge? Could the Sumerian flood be a cultural echo of several catastrophes, layered upon one another until the details blurred and only the trauma remained? The Sumerians did not describe the flood as a simple inundation. Their texts say the gods decided to erase the seed of humanity, that the wind roared, the storm raged for days, that the land shattered like a pot. These descriptions feel less like an overflowed river and more like the psychological residue of a world-ending event, something abrupt, violent, incomprehensible. Something that destroyed not only people, but the memory structures that preserved their knowledge. In the Atrahasis epic, wisdom disappears during the flood, not just life. Tools are lost, songs forgotten. The myths, laws, arts, crafts, scattered. This is not a description of drowning fields, it is a description of civilizational amnesia. And afterward, the world is smaller, lifespans shorter, humanity diminished. The gods impose limitations so that the noise of mankind may not rise again. Scholars interpret this metaphorically. Yet the reduction in lifespan parallels something real. The transition from Paleolithic diets and lifestyles to early agricultural societies brought measurable declines in health and longevity. Could myth serve as a symbolic encoding of biological, cultural, and technological loss? Curiously, similar myths appear across the world. In India's Puranic literature, Manu survives a great flood and preserves knowledge. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth after waters wipe out earlier peoples. Indigenous Australian stories describe rising seas drowning once inhabited plains, narratives now supported by geological studies of post-glacial sea level rise. Ancient Chinese texts record repeated deluges that forced societal reorganization. Even in Mesoamerica, flood myths describe worlds destroyed and rebuilt. It is not the universality of the story that is striking. Cultures independently experience floods, but the fact that so many describe the flood as the end of an earlier age with characteristics different from our own. Long lives, great knowledge, powerful ancestors, structured societies, then a sudden break. The Sumerian version stands out because it does not treat the flood as a divine metaphor. It treats it as a chronological boundary. The king list acknowledges two histories, one before, one after, two kinds of kings, two kinds of time. That rigidity is difficult to explain away. Even more curious is the way the flood interacts with the idea of hidden knowledge. In multiple Sumerian texts, the gods do not simply destroy humanity. They attempt to hide or remove something dangerous, or sacred, or both. There are lines describing forbidden knowledge sealed away beneath the deep, objects that must not be retrieved, memories that must not be reassembled. Whether symbolic or literal, the theme persists. The flood was not just an ending, but a concealment. Modern researchers debate what this concealed element might represent. Lost technologies, forgotten astronomical alignments. Oral history is too ancient to maintain coherence. Or perhaps something simpler, collective memory itself. The collapse of complex societies erases knowledge by default. Writing disappears. Tools rust. Rituals lose context. What remains is myth, dim, distorted testimony of what once was. Maybe that is why the Sumerian flood feels so vast. It is not merely describing water, but the drowning of memory. And yet, there is a whisper beneath the narratives, a suggestion that not everything was lost, that something, a fragment, a lineage, a method of remembering survived, carried into the new world like a fragile ember. Perhaps that ember is the very text we now read, the kingless quiet insistence that before the flood there was something else, something larger, something we are not meant to forget. But as one walks through the stratified ruins of Mesopotamia, another question rises like a low tide. If the flood erased a world, what did that world look like? And why does its outline still linger faintly beneath the silt, refusing to disappear completely? Among all the relics recovered from the cradle of civilization, few objects feel as unsettling as the damaged, half-erased tablets often referred to, quietly, almost reluctantly, by scholars as the forbidden texts of Mesopotamia. Not forbidden in any official sense, not banned by decree, but forbidden in the way that forgotten memories make the mind hesitate. Too strange, too incomplete, too uncomfortable to confront directly. These tablets are fractured, charred, scraped, their surfaces worn as if by centuries of human hands attempting to preserve and erase them at the same time. And in their broken lines, one senses not simply the loss of information, but the loss of something someone once tried very hard to hide. The most enigmatic among them is the tablet fragment known as Eridu Genesis, often overshadowed by the more famous Epic of Gilgamesh. Yet it is older, closer to the early pulse of civilization, and its tone carries a gravity that later myths soften. In its surviving lines, the gods debate the future of humanity, not with the distant poetic flourish that characterizes later compositions, but with a terse, almost administrative tension. Plans are made, decisions whispered, knowledge assigned, knowledge withdrawn. And then the sudden shift, the flood, after which nothing is the same. But the Eridu Genesis tablet is incomplete. Entire sections are gouged, dissolved, or missing. Scholars argue whether the damage is accidental or the result of ancient editing practices. Some researchers note that the breakage patterns are inconsistent with natural wear. Certain lines are intact, others appear selectively removed. The uneven erosion raises the uncomfortable possibility that the parts dealing with the time before contained material deemed too dangerous or too heretical by later scribes. Mesopotamian archives are full of palimpsests, texts overwritten intentionally to reshape political or religious narratives. Who can say whether the same impulse did not reach further back, to deeper layers of memory the later empires found inconvenient? And the unease deepens through other fragments. Some from Nippur, some from Sippar, some from the palace libraries of Nineveh. A recurring motif appears: references to eras of knowledge predating the earliest known cities, eras described obliquely as when the decrees were not yet divided, when humanity still shared one understanding, or when the old laws were not hidden. These lines are vague, poetic, and yet strangely precise in their tone. They speak of a world organized around a different kind of wisdom, something collective, unfragmented, unbroken. The question, of course, is what this knowledge might have been. Most academics interpret these passages symbolically, reading them as allegories of primordial unity. But a small number of scholars, linguists, archaeologists, comparative historians, suggest something more literal, that these fragments may encode dim memories of earlier cultural systems erased or transformed by climatic or political upheaval, not an advanced lost civilization in the sensational modern sense, but a complex social or spiritual framework whose details have simply not survived the brutality of time. Still, certain phrases complicate the minimalist reading. One Sippar fragment, eroded at its edges, describes the tools that shaped without noise and the measures that aligned the earth to the sky. Another, from a broken text attributed to the priests of Eridu, mentions objects buried where no scribe may reach, sealed until the age when the watchers return. Scholars debate the translation endlessly. Some argue that tools refers to ritual instruments, watchers to deities, alignment to astronomical observance. Others suggest the language hints at practices or instruments no longer understood. None of these interpretations satisfy fully. The tablets feel like voices speaking from beneath layers of cultural editing, their intended meaning blurred but not entirely erased. And then there are the tablets deliberately left untranslated. This is not conspiracy. It is a quiet academic reality. Museums and universities hold thousands of cuneiform fragments, far more than have ever been published. Many contain only mundane text, trade receipts, legal records, temple inventories, but scattered among them are fragments whose unusual vocabulary, broken syntax, or mythic tone make them difficult to classify. And in a world of limited time, funding, and scholarly personnel, such tablets often remain catalogued but unexamined. A few researchers who have sifted through these untranslated pieces have remarked, informally, in conference hallways and quiet academic gatherings, that the border between myth and memory in early Mesopotamian writing is far more ambiguous than the public realizes. Some fragments blur genres intentionally, combining ritual instructions with mythic genealogy, astronomical observation with accounts of destruction, prophecy with administrative record. It becomes difficult to determine when a text is describing an event metaphorically or recalling a historical rupture viewed through theological interpretation. And behind this uncertainty, a deeper question stirs. What if the earliest Sumerian scribes themselves were struggling to preserve memories from a past already slipping beyond coherent storytelling? What if the forbidden quality of these tablets is not about hidden knowledge, but about the fragility of memory itself? The scribes of Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, young men trained in temples, copied texts that were already ancient to them. They inherited myths whose origins they did not witness. They repeated phrases whose meanings were now symbolic rather than literal. In their careful wedge strokes, one senses a mixture of reverence and confusion, as though they were preserving something they only partially understood. But there is another layer, one more troubling. Throughout Mesopotamian history, powerful institutions controlled the written record. Kings commissioned official inscriptions glorifying their reigns. Temples curated their own histories. Empires rewrote genealogies to legitimize conquest. When Assurbanipal built his great library at Nineveh, he collected texts from across the region. But some scholars note that his archivists also destroyed works considered politically dangerous or theologically inconsistent. If this occurred in the first millennium BCE, why assume earlier periods were exempt? If later kings shaped the written past, why not earlier priests? And if scribes edited, erased, or reinterpreted myths to suit new rulers, new cults, new cosmologies, what happened to the oldest layers, the ones from before the flood, before the rise of cities, before the earliest temples? How many fragments were lost intentionally? How many redacted? How many altered subtly enough that modern translators never question them? The silence surrounding the earliest era is not only archaeological, it is textual. The more one examines these ancient tablets, the clearer it becomes that the earliest chapters of humanity's story were copied and recopied through hands that belonged to institutions with their own motives, fears, and desires. Perhaps this is why so many tablets appear damaged in precisely the places that would have shed light on pre-flood history. Accident or intention, no one can say. But the pattern is difficult to ignore. Still, the faintest traces of that lost knowledge cling to the surviving fragments like dust. A line here, a phrase there, a hint of a world organized around principles unfamiliar to the Bronze Age mind. A world whose memory the Sumerians seemed both to honor and to fear. Their reverence for the decrees suggests they believed knowledge could be sacred, powerful, even dangerous. Their insistence that some laws of old must remain hidden implies caution, not ignorance. Someone at some time believed that remembering too much might threaten the fragile order emerging after the flood, and that raises a haunting question. What did they fear remembering? Was it a technology, a disaster, a cycle, or simply the recognition that civilization had risen and fallen before, and might do so again? Perhaps the damage on the tablets is not an accident. Perhaps it is a warning, a quiet gesture from those who lived through the boundary between worlds, a way of saying, some truths must be carried carefully, or not at all. There is a moment in the study of Sumerian mythology when the reader pauses, not because of divine beings descending from the sky in dramatic strokes, but because of the quiet, persistent way the text refer to the Anuna and Anunnaki as if they were not gods at all, but a category of beings whose nature has grown blurry with time. The earliest tablets do not paint them as the omnipotent sky rulers that later traditions imagined. Instead, they appear as the princely ones, the great ones, or simply the ones of royal seed. Their titles fluctuate, their roles overlap, and their descriptions refuse to settle neatly into the modern hierarchy of gods. It is this ambiguity, not the later sensational narratives, that makes them so deeply unsettling. Language is often treated as stable, but in the world of ancient Mesopotamia, words drifted like sediments in a shifting river. Anuna, in the oldest context, simply means the seed of An, the lineage of the sky. Not literal offspring necessarily, but a group distinguished by knowledge, authority, or antiquity. Later scribes expanded the term to include deities of the underworld, or the 50 great gods, or the council of heaven. But the earliest inscriptions paint a sparser picture. A small group of special figures attached to the earliest cities and the earliest knowledge, and it is the timing that creates the tension. The Anuna appear in the earliest myths precisely at the transition between prehistory and history, in the moments when writing crystallizes, cities cohere, and cultural memory begins to solidify. They do not descend in a blaze of mythic spectacle. They simply appear, already formed, already wise, already entrenched in roles of rulership, judgment, and teaching. The texts rarely describe their origins. They are simply there. Some scholars argue that the Anuna were originally ancestral figures, perhaps priest-kings from a proto-Sumerian era, elevated into myth over time. This interpretation gains weight when one examines the way certain Anuna figures, like in Mijuranki of Sippa, are described. He is not portrayed primarily as a god, but as a human or human-like figure, chosen to receive special knowledge. The tablet of the heavens, the secrets of divination, the measures of the winds. Later Jewish tradition links him with Enoch, another figure taken up into divine company and entrusted with hidden knowledge. The parallels are striking enough to make even cautious scholars raise their eyebrows. But if the Anuna were once human, or something close to it, how did their memory become so distorted? And why did later traditions insist on portraying them as divine? The answer may lie not in theology, but in the psychology of cultural collapse. Sumerian myths repeatedly describe a world in which knowledge arrives suddenly. Wisdom granted, skills bestowed, me delivered. These are passive verbs. Humanity receives, it does not discover. The earliest scribes attribute the origins of agriculture, city building, kingship, measurement, and law, not to gradual innovation, but to instruction. This could reflect a worldview that credits gods for all creative acts. But it could also reflect something more subtle, the sense that certain knowledge appeared too abruptly to have been invented locally. A memory, perhaps, of receiving traditions from an earlier culture whose identity had already faded. If the Anuna originally represented these earlier transmitters, the keepers of memory from a pre-flood world, then the evolution of their identity into divine figures would be a natural result of the centuries of distance between them and later Sumerian scribes. Over time, human teachers become culture heroes become demigods become gods. The process is not mystical. It is simply the way memory deforms when direct lineage is lost. And yet, the earliest myths contain details that feel strangely concrete. The Anuna are described as judges who assemble in council, priests who oversee sacred measures, figures who distribute territories, assign roles, and govern knowledge. They behave less like cosmic beings and more like a ruling elite. They appear at crucial junctures, founding cities, shaping rituals, defining laws. They are attached to specific places: Eridu, Nippur, Uruk, Bad Tabira. Their actions are geographically rooted, not celestial. Even their depictions in art complicate the image of divine beings. The earliest figurines associated with Elite Ubaid or early Uruk cultures portray individuals with elongated skulls, large almond-shaped eyes, and postures of authority. Some hold staffs or objects whose function is unknown. Scholars interpret these figures variously as deities, priests, ancestors, or symbolic representations. But what strikes many observers is their uniformity across distant sites. They suggest a class set apart, distinguished perhaps by vocation, appearance, or tradition. If these were the prototypes for the Anuna, then the mythologization process may have begun long before writing. Still, the most intriguing detail appears in texts describing the Anunnaki as those who determined the fates. In Mesopotamian context, fates are not supernatural destinies. They are cultural roles, laws, and decrees, the building blocks of civilization. To determine fates is to shape society. It suggests legislative authority, not cosmic magic. The Anuna's domain, then, was not the sky, but the structure of human life. Some researchers propose that the Anuna represent a priestly or administrative class from an earlier era, possibly even survivors from pre-flood settlements who carried traditions across the rupture. This theory, while speculative, explains why the earliest cities appear fully formed, why their planning reflects long-standing patterns, and why their rituals reference ancient decrees with no clear origin in the archaeological record. But this interpretation leads to a deeper, more unsettling thought. If the Anuna preserved knowledge from before the flood, then the myths depicting them as descending into early cities may encode memories of migrating populations, refugees carrying the remnants of older cultural systems. Their descent may be metaphorical, arriving at new settlements after old ones vanished beneath rising waters. This aligns with geological evidence of rapid climate shifts at the end of the Pleistocene. Coastlines drowned, Rivers changed course, plains became gulfs. Human groups would have been forced inland, carrying oral traditions and practical knowledge. To the earliest inhabitants of Mesopotamia's new cities, these refugees might have seemed like bearers of forgotten wisdom, keepers of a world that no longer existed. In mythic reinterpretation, they became divine, and yet not all descriptions fit comfortably within this framework. Some texts refer to the Anuna as the seven who decree, aligning them with ancient astronomical groupings, specifically the seven stars, the Pleiades. This blending of terrestrial and celestial imagery complicates efforts to root the Anuna in purely human origins. Were they symbolically tied to the stars because their knowledge came from sky watching? Or did later cultures project celestial significance onto a once human lineage? Symbolic interpretations abound. But the persistence of this ambiguity, human yet divine, mortal yet immortal, rulers on earth yet tied to heaven, suggests that the Sumerians themselves were struggling to categorize figures inherited from a time whose memory was already fractured. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the way later myths emphasize the withdrawal of the Anuna. At a certain point, after the flood, after kingship becomes fragmented, the Anuna retreat. They no longer walk among cities. They no longer instruct humanity directly. Their role becomes distant, ritualized, confined to temples and hymns. It is as though the memory of direct transmission fades, replaced by ceremonial reverence. What caused this withdrawal? A historical rupture, a shift in political power, a symbolic recognition that the old knowledge was no longer fully understood. Or was it simply that the descendants of the Anuna, the human lineage behind the myth, were absorbed into the populations around them, their distinction lost over generations? Whatever the answer, the silence that follows is palpable. The Sumerians sung of the Anuna in past tense, with a tone of longing, as though recalling not gods but teachers who had vanished. And that lingering yearning carries its own quiet question. If the Anuna were once the keepers of forgotten knowledge, what pieces of that knowledge remain in the myths, and how much was lost when the last of them disappeared from the earth, leaving only shadows behind? There's a certain stillness that settles over the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, and one stands before the remains of a ziggurat. Not the grand, reconstructed silhouettes found in modern illustrations, but the real ones, the eroded mounds, stepped shadows of what once rose like mountains forged by human hands. Their presence feels older than the civilizations that claimed them, older than the kings who rebuilt them again and again, older even than the myths that tried to explain them. And perhaps that is why they continue to unsettle archaeologists, because in their silent geometry, they preserve a memory that refuses to be fully deciphered. The ziggurat of Ur is the most famous, but it is not the oldest. Earlier forms rise at Eridu and Uruk, layers upon layers of construction, each rebuilding echoing a design that no one seems to have invented. The very concept of the ziggurat appears fully formed in the archaeological record. There is no gradual development of intermediate architectural experiments, no tentative attempts at stepped structures. It is as though the idea arrived whole, settled into the minds of the earliest city builders, and immediately became sacred. This abruptness mirrors the sudden appearance of writing, agriculture, and kingship, leaving scholars to wonder why so many foundational concepts appear without clear precedent. The Sumerians themselves claimed no credit. Their myths state plainly that the Imki, the divine decrees that include architecture, ritual, and social order, were not created but restored or returned. This language is significant. One does not restore what has never existed. One does not return what was not once lost. When they describe the building of the first temples, their tone is not that of invention but remembrance, a rebuilding of something that should have been there all along. This sense of memory embedded in architecture becomes especially vivid at Eridu. Excavations reveal 18 levels of construction beneath the ziggurat platform, each replicating the same basic layout. A sanctuary positioned on a raised mound, oriented to cardinal directions with uncanny consistency. The earliest levels are modest, but the ritual geometry is unmistakably deliberate. Scholars interpret the repetition as evidence of ritual rebuilding, a tradition spanning centuries. But another interpretation quietly lingers, that the earliest builders were imitating a template, one older than the city itself, one preserved in memory or story. Even the orientation of these structures raises questions. The ziggurats align not merely to cardinal directions but often to solar or lunar cycles. The platform at Ur is angled to the southeast, possibly marking solstitial sunrise. At other sites, alignments correlate with rising stars or seasonal winds, patterns that require sustained astronomical observation. Yet these alignments appear in the earliest phases of construction, long before the development of systematic astronomy in the historical record. How did the first city builders acquire such precision? Mainstream scholars propose that trial and error over centuries refined these alignments. But the earliest ziggurat layers show no evidence of crude experimentation. They are not approximations. They are confident executions of a concept fully understood. The implications are difficult to reconcile. Architectural mastery without an evolutionary sequence challenges the notion of gradual civilizational growth. It suggests instead a transfer of knowledge, whether through migration, cultural inheritance, or the lingering memory of practices predating the cities themselves. And it is precisely here that the mystery deepens. When archaeologists compare Mesopotamian ziggurats to stepped structures in distant regions, pyramids in Egypt, Andean huarcas, Mesoamerican temples, they caution against drawing direct connections. Independent invention is the safe explanation. Yet even cautious scholars acknowledge the uncanny convergence in symbolic function. Elevated platforms meant to connect earth and sky, to anchor rituals tied to celestial cycles, to serve as the locus of political and spiritual authority. Why should societies separated by continents converge on the same architectural archetype? Some argue that the stepped form reflects a universal human impulse, the need to elevate ritual above the mundane. Perhaps the similarity runs deeper than form. In many civilizations, these platforms function as cosmic diagrams, structures meant to represent mountains, stars, or the axis mundi connecting realms. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats are often described as binding points, where heaven and earth meet. Their names reflect this role. Itimananki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Ekua, the mountain house. Enki's temple at Eridu, a house built on the faraway water. These names feel echo-like, as though referring to something already ancient when first spoken. What makes this more intriguing is that certain early ziggurats show construction techniques inconsistent with the local environment. Some structures use bitumen and fired brick at periods when such technology should have been rare or experimental. Others incorporate stone brought from distant regions, despite the absence of local quarries. These anomalies complicate the narrative that early Mesopotamian societies were still discovering their technological capabilities. They suggest intentional design choices guided by older knowledge, habits carried forward even when their original purpose had faded. In some ziggurats, archaeologists have found wall cavities tuned to resonate at specific frequencies. These are not accidental features. Recent studies in archaeoacoustics propose that such cavities amplify chanting or musical instruments, creating a vibratory environment meant to induce altered states of consciousness or ritual synchronization. The idea that early builders understood and manipulated sound architecture seems shocking, yet similar practices appear in Neolithic Europe, at sites like Newgrange, and in the Andean world, where temples were built to resonate with conch shells. If these acoustic techniques emerged independently, it suggests a deep human intuition about sacred space. But if they were inherited, it hints at a prehistoric tradition shared across continents. A possibility mainstream scholarship avoids but cannot fully dismiss. Another mystery lies in the purpose of the ziggurat. Though often described as temples, many of them show no evidence of habitation or internal chambers. They are platforms, not sanctuaries in the domestic sense. Rituals occurred at their summits, yet nothing was stored within. Their massive bulk served apparently no practical function. Why commit such resources to a structure with minimal interior space? Some scholars argue that the height itself was symbolic, the desire to ascend closer to the heavens. Others suggest the platforms served as flood refuges, though the scale far exceeds practical necessity. Another view is that the ziggurat was a mnemonic device, encoding cosmological knowledge in its tiers. Each level represented a cosmic layer, each staircase a path of ascent, each directional alignment a celestial marker. In this reading, the ziggurat is a memory palace of the universe, a physical embodiment of knowledge. If so, then the early Sumerians were not merely building temples. They were reconstructing a world whose origins may lie in a time before written history. And here, another echo appears. In later Babylonian texts, the gods are said to have hidden the plans of the temples, blueprints of cosmic order within the deep. Priests sought these plans during rituals, retrieving not physical objects but symbolic knowledge meant to restore order after times of chaos. Could the earliest ziggurats represent attempts to rebuild the cosmic order, remembered dimly from before the flood? A material reenactment of a lost world? Even the uniformity of the ziggurat's stepped form hints at this possibility. Across centuries, through political upheavals and cultural shifts, the design persists. Kings rebuild them but rarely innovate. They modify scale, materials, and ornamentation, but not structure. It is as though the fundamental blueprint cannot be altered, either out of reverence or out of fear. Perhaps that is the most haunting aspect. The rigid fidelity to a design whose original meaning may already have been forgotten. The Sumerians spoke of the ancient decrees as though they were inheritors of something fragile, something they had a duty to preserve even when its deeper purpose eluded them. When standing at the foot of a ruined ziggurat, one feels the weight of that duty. The mound is eroded, its tiers collapsed, its summit long lost, yet its shape persists. It towers not as a remnant of architectural ambition, but as a memory, one carved into earth and brick rather than clay tablets. And in the silence of that structure, one is left with a quiet question, unresolved and persistent. If the earliest ziggurats were built in imitation of something older, something remembered dimly, what original structure, what mountain, what temple, what world were they trying to rebuild? There are moments in the study of ancient civilizations when the silence of the past becomes almost audible, not as an absence but as a faint vibration lingering in the stones and bones and vessels left behind. In Mesopotamia, this silence carries a strange texture, one shaped not by the void but by echoes. For alongside the tablets and temples and broken relics, the Sumerians left another kind of record, one far less tangible, the memory of sound. And in the oldest layers of their culture, sound behaves less like an artistic expression and more like a technology, something capable of structuring space, shaping ritual, and holding memory in ways modern minds have nearly forgotten. The earliest evidence for this comes not from myth, but from clay. Excavations at Ur uncovered some of the oldest known musical instruments in the world, lyres, harps, and reed pipes dating back more than 4,000 years. Their sophistication is surprising. The lyre is not rudimentary, they're carved with precision, their strings arranged for complex harmonic sequences, their resonance chambers show signs of intentional acoustic tuning. They belong not to an emerging musical tradition, but to a well-developed one whose roots must stretch further back than the archaeological record allows us to trace. Even more intriguing are the fragments of notation discovered on cuneiform tablets. These tablets contain instructions for tuning scales, referencing intervals and modes that imply a deep understanding of musical mathematics. A so-called Hurrian hymn from Ugarit, though later and from a different region, demonstrates that ancient Near Eastern cultures preserved complex systems of pitch and rhythm. But the Sumerian system is older still, and scholars have long wondered, how did a civilization supposedly just stepping into organized society already possess such refined acoustics? Yet instruments and notation alone do not convey the deepest mystery. That lies in the architecture. Archaeoacoustic studies performed at ancient temples and ziggurat foundations reveal that many early Mesopotamian structures amplify certain frequencies with striking precision. The narrow chambers beneath the ziggurat of Ur, for example, resonate strongly around 110 Hz, a frequency known to induce a trance-like state in listeners. Similar resonant patterns appear in early shrines at Eridu and in subterranean rooms at Nippur. These effects are unlikely to be accidental. The consistent tuning suggests intentional design, a deliberate shaping of sound to influence the experience of the sacred. Why would the earliest temple builders invest in such acoustic precision? What purpose did these resonances serve? Some scholars propose that sound played a central role in ritual, facilitating altered states of consciousness during ceremonies. Others believe that resonance reinforced the spoken or sung recitation of sacred texts, making them easier to remember or more emotionally powerful. A few, more cautiously, suggest that these acoustic features may reflect inherited traditions, practices whose origins lie in a pre-urban culture that valued sound as a tool for cosmological alignment or healing. But the most haunting possibility is that these structures encoded memory itself. In a world without writing, sound becomes the vessel for knowledge. And indeed, Sumerian myths hint repeatedly at the use of sound as a means of preserving sacred truth. In certain texts, the decrees of civilization, the me, are delivered not visually but through chant and recitation. Enki, the god of wisdom, sings the me into existence. Ritual specialists are said to bind knowledge through tone, open the gates through sound, or call forth the measures with a single note. These phrases, though poetic, suggest an understanding of sound as a performative force, a medium in which order can be created, remembered, or restored. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have long known that melody and rhythm act as mnemonic devices, allowing long texts to be preserved across generations with remarkable accuracy. Could the earliest Sumerian traditions have relied on similar acoustics to maintain continuity with a world already fading from memory? Could the very structures they built, resonant chambers, echoing corridors, elevated platforms, have been designed to serve as instruments, amplifying the voices of the past so they could be carried into the future? This possibility grows more plausible when one considers the peculiar descriptions of the Anunna in earlier texts. Some hymns depict them not as gods descending from the sky, but as voices that command the foundations, or those whose speech shapes the earth. These metaphors are usually interpreted as divine authority, but when read alongside the evidence for ritual acoustics, they take on another shade of meaning. Perhaps the Anunna were remembered not as beings of supernatural power, but as custodians of a sonic tradition, teachers of chants, keepers of tonal knowledge, practitioners of a ritual system built upon vibration. That interpretation aligns with a curious detail found in several early hymns, the idea that the world itself was spoken into order. While this echoes many creation myths across cultures, in Sumerian literature the emphasis is unusually technical. Words are described not as mystical commands but as measured utterances, structured vibrations aligned with cosmic cycles. These descriptions feel oddly procedural, as though referring to a system of recitation or harmonic tuning rather than metaphysical creation. And this brings us to the most enigmatic aspect of ancient Mesopotamian sound culture: the instruments that should not exist. Among the ruins of temples at Ur and Mari, archaeologists discovered a series of drums and resonators constructed from materials that, according to traditional models of technological development, should not have been used in this context. Some drums incorporate bitumen-sealed chambers designed to amplify low frequencies, Others use wooden frames shaped to produce directional sound beams. These are not primitive tools. They hint at acoustical engineering far more developed than expected for the time. Even more perplexing is a set of clay objects known as sound cones, or acoustic cones, found in temples and administrative buildings. Their purpose is unclear. Some believe they were decorative, others that they were used in rituals. But experimental testing reveals that when placed in certain configurations, the cones focus and channel sound in surprising ways, amplifying whispered speech or enhancing chants. Could these cones be remnants of a sound-based ritual tradition, inherited from a pre-flood culture? A tradition whose original purpose, whether healing, storytelling, social cohesion, or cosmological reenactment, became diluted over time, leaving only these objects as hints of a deeper, forgotten system. One cannot help noticing how other ancient cultures employed sound in similarly mysterious ways. In Malta, the apodrome of Hausa contains chambers tuned to specific resonant frequencies. In Peru, the Shavin temple complex uses conduits that create disorienting soundscapes. In the British Isles, standing stones enhance low-frequency resonance. These practices stretch across continents, across millennia, yet they converge on the same phenomenon: sacred sound as a tool for shaping human experience. Is this convergence mere coincidence, or does it reflect a shared memory, an inherited understanding that sound could do more than entertain, that it could preserve, connect, or transform? The Sumerians treat sound with an unusual reverence. They describe chants that awaken the old order, hymns that restore what was lost, and tones that open the pathways hidden beneath the deep. These are not simply poetic flourishes. They hint at a worldview in which sound plays a fundamental role in maintaining the coherence of society, in linking the present to a past that cannot be accessed through sight or touch. Perhaps this is why later Mesopotamian texts lament the diminishing power of ritual sound. They speak of hymns lost to wind, chants that no longer open the gates, and tones whose meaning has passed into silence. Such lines feel like echoes of a memory fading, a memory of a time when knowledge was not stored in clay, but in voice and vibration. And as one stands in the ruined chambers of ancient temples where whispers still bounce off stone with uncanny clarity, another quiet question begins to form. If sound once carried the knowledge of a forgotten world, then what fragments of that world still hum beneath the dust, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear them? There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs only to the ancient sky. Before streetlights, before cities, before the haze of human industry dimmed the stars, a darkness so complete that the heavens no longer sit above the world, but around it, enveloping everything in a crystalline sphere of glittering precision. The Sumerians lived beneath that sky, and in their earliest writings, one senses not awe alone, but a familiarity that feels almost inherited. They did not merely observe the stars, they remembered them, and that is where the mystery begins, for that earliest astronomical knowledge appears far too structured, far too refined to belong to a civilization supposedly just discovering the mechanics of cities and agriculture. Scholars point to the Emul-Apin tablets, the great compendium of Babylonian astronomy compiled centuries later. But the roots of that knowledge reach deeper into the Sumerian past, much deeper than the historical record can comfortably account for. Because even in the earliest layers of Mesopotamian writing, the constellations appear fully named, fully systematized, their cycles recorded with a precision that implies centuries of observation. And yet, there is no evidence of a long incremental tradition leading toward this knowledge. It emerges suddenly, like a star rising over the horizon. Take, for instance, the Sumerian recognition of the Pleiades, the seven sisters, referred to as Amol-Mel. Their placement, the heliacal rising, their ritual significance. These elements appear not as discoveries, but as inherited understandings. The same is true of Orion, Sepa-Zian-Ne, the Bull of Heaven, Guan-Ne, and the paths of the planets. The Sumerians distinguished the fixed stars from the wandering ones. They charted the movements of Venus, likely building the precursor to the famous Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa. And they did all this with a confidence suggesting they were not learning, but recalling. And this recall is what troubles historians, for astronomical knowledge does not spontaneously emerge in complete form. It requires patient, consistent, generational tracking. It demands long-term data, observations spanning centuries. How then did the Sumerians possess such detailed star lore so early in their history? Where did they inherit it from? One explanation is that the Sumerians migrated from regions where astronomical traditions were already well developed, but there is no clear archaeological evidence of a precursor society with the necessary sophistication. Another explanation proposes that their star lore originated during the late Paleolithic, preserved through oral tradition until the rise of cities. Yet this does not explain the precision of their recorded cycles. A more unsettling hypothesis suggests something else. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the earliest Sumerian texts reflects observations of a sky not identical to our own. Certain star positions described in very early tablets correspond awkwardly with their current locations, as if the observers lived at a different latitude or a different epoch. Scholars who follow this line of thought note the axial precession gradually shifts the orientation of the sky over millennia. Could the earliest Sumerian star names and relationships reflect memories from long before 3000 BCE? Memories preserved from a time when humans lived under a sky whose patterns were slightly different, subtly rotated, marked by alignments long forgotten by later generations. This possibility, though speculative, gains strength when considering the Sumerian emphasis on celestial cycles that take far longer than a human life to observe. The text referenced the precessional motion indirectly, speaking of the turning of the long ages and the shifting of the northern star. These phrases are vague, poetic, but unmistakably suggest knowledge of slow stellar drift, something that requires at least centuries of careful recording. Yet the Sumerians do not speak of discovering these cycles. They speak as though they are maintaining them. This pattern emerges again in the way they describe their first cities. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur. Each is said to have been aligned with the paths of heaven, not metaphorically but literally. Some are oriented toward the rising of Sirius, others toward the path of Venus, still others toward solstitial or equinoctial points. These alignments are not accidental. They require a society capable of precise astronomical measurement. But the alignments appear in the earliest construction phases, before the rise of the priesthoods, before the codification of the calendar, before cities grew large enough to support specialized astronomers, which leaves a question lingering like a faint glow along the horizon. If they were not discovering these alignments, then who taught them? Some researchers propose that Sumerian cosmology is a refinement of older, pre-urban skywatching traditions. Evidence from Göbekli Tepe shows that hunter-gatherers at the end of the last ice age built monumental structures aligned with stars. Other Neolithic sites across Europe and Anatolia reveal similar alignments. Perhaps the Sumerians inherited this archaic astronomical tradition, reshaping it into written form. Yet this explanation also has its limits. The Sumerian calendar system, particularly their division of the year into predictable lunisolar cycles, reflects an advanced mathematical sophistication. Such precision requires not merely observation, but accumulation of long-term records. Paleolithic societies, mobile and dispersed, were unlikely to maintain multi-century data sets. The Sumerians, however, behave as though such data was already available. All of this raises a deeper issue: the consistent Sumerian claim that their knowledge was not created but given. In myth, the star knowledge comes from the Anuna, the printers of heaven. But the earliest descriptions of these beings do not emphasize divinity. They emphasize instruction. They are the ones who measure the celestial paths, the watchers of the vault, the ones who open the gates of the sky. These are not the roles of gods, but of astronomers, specialists whose expertise predates the cities that later worship them. Could these figures represent a lineage of star watchers from a pre-flood culture? Could the Sumerian priesthood be the institutional descendant of a much older tradition of sky observation, one nearly wiped out by climatic catastrophe, preserved only in fragments, then restored piecemeal as cities rose from the mud? If so, then the earliest Sumerian records would not be the beginning of astronomy, but the recovery of it. There is another clue. In the Malapin tradition, the sky is divided into three great pathways: the path of Enlil, the path of Anu, and the path of Enki. These divisions map onto latitudinal zones, astronomical bands corresponding to specific visibility patterns of stars. This is not a beginner system. This is the work of a civilization with a deep time view of the heavens, and yet the scholars who compiled Apin in the first millennium BCE insisted that these divisions were ancient when they received them. They did not innovate, they inherited. But inherited from whom? One fragment from Nippur refers to the sky before the flood as ordered differently. Another speaks of the star of the north that wandered from its throne. Still another mentions the old watchers who saw the constellations as they were in former days. These lines are ambiguous, mythic even, but they suggest a memory of a sky whose patterns were not identical to those of the historical era. Whether this refers to precessional shift or to the reorganization of constellations over time, it implies continuity of observation across many centuries, perhaps millennia. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes not from the tablets, but from the ruins of the first cities themselves. At Tel Brak, at Uruk, at Eridu, the earliest sacred precincts align with celestial markers that no longer hold the same significance today. Their alignments make sense only when projected back thousands of years earlier than their conventional construction dates. Alignments that match star positions around 10,000 BCE rather than 3000 BCE. Is this coincidence? Or could the earliest city builders have been following blueprints based on star positions remembered from a world long gone? We cannot know, but the precision is striking enough to haunt the margins of academic discussion. And it leads inevitably to a quiet question, one that rises slowly, like the glow of the morning star before dawn. If the Sumerians remembered a sky older than their own civilization, then whose sky were they remembering? There is a strange tension that arises whenever scholars speak about the earliest libraries of Mesopotamia. Not the grand, well-documented repositories of the first millennium BCE, but the older, quieter, more fragile rooms of clay and reed that once housed the earliest records of human memory. These spaces do not resemble libraries the way modern minds imagine them. They were not built for public access. They were not arranged for intellectual curiosity. They were vaults, silent, deliberate, selective. And the more one studies the fragments that survive from these rooms, the more one senses that they were not designed to preserve all knowledge, but to protect certain kinds of knowledge while quietly letting other kinds disappear. The ruins of Nippur are perhaps the best example. Long before Nineveh's great library, long before Assurbanipal boasted of his ability to read tablets from before the flood, Nippur served as the intellectual and spiritual heart of Sumer. Priests there controlled the calendar, standardized rituals, edited hymns, and curated genealogies. It was the place where kings went for legitimacy, and it was the place where scribes copied texts that were already ancient to them. Yet much of what they copied seems curated in a way that suggests careful boundaries. Mythological texts sit beside lexical lists. Hymns appear beside astronomical calculations, incantations beside legal formulae. But what is missing is just as interesting as what survives. There are no explicit historical narratives of the earliest eras, no explanations for the origins of their knowledge, no accounts of the pre-flood world beyond fragmented references. It is as though the scribes inherited a set of memories they did not fully understand and, uncertain how to handle them, placed them at the margins. The same pattern appears at Sippar, a site often mentioned in ancient texts as the home of the Sun Temple and a center of scholarship. Excavations there uncovered tablets dealing with mathematics, stars, rituals, omens, but again, nothing that clearly describes the world before the rise of cities. One broken tablet refers briefly to the days when the Watchers wrote the decrees, but its meaning is opaque. Another mentions the laws of old that were sealed when the waters rose. The lines break off. Whether these passages refer to mythic metaphor or to dim cultural memory, there is no way to tell. The archivists of Sippar did not preserve explanations, only hints. And there is Nineveh. The famous library built under Assurbanipal was an attempt to collect all knowledge, yet even there, the pattern holds. Among the tens of thousands of tablets, epics, hymns, omens, rituals, there is a glaring silence about the earliest eras. The scribes copied texts they claimed were from before the flood, but those texts rarely describe the world itself. They describe rituals, star patterns, genealogies of divine or semi-divine beings. They describe the flood as a rupture, but not what came before in any detail. It is as if the pre-flood memory survived only in structured fragments, scattered phrases, and encoded lists rather than coherent narratives. Some historians argue that this absence is the result of simple loss. Time erodes fragile clay, and earlier tablets did not survive. A reasonable explanation. Yet this argument grows thin when one considers the obsessive care with which later scribes copied their texts. If comprehensive pre-flood narratives had existed in the early periods, is it likely that none survived? Or is it more plausible that they never existed in written form at all? That the earliest knowledge was transmitted orally, ritually, symbolically, and that the first scribes to adopt writing recorded only the fragments they could still grasp. And then there is the darker possibility that some knowledge was intentionally excluded. Ancient Mesopotamia was not a society of open archives. Knowledge was power, religious power, political power, cosmological power. The priesthoods of Eridu, Nippur, and Uruk did not simply preserve texts, they curated them. They decided which stories were worthy of copying, which genealogies to emphasize, which myths to legitimize, which rituals to normalize, which records to bury. The king list itself is an example of this curation. It presents a linear succession of rulers stretching back into impossibly ancient times, clearly edited to support political claims of later dynasties. If such editing shaped public texts, what of the restricted ones, those stored in temple archives accessible only to initiated scribes? The silence of these libraries feels intentional, especially when one considers how consistently the scribes frame pre-flood knowledge as forbidden, hidden, or dangerous. In myth, the gods seal away certain laws beneath the deep. In ritual texts, there are references to words not to be spoken in the daylight, names that must remain sealed, knowledge that breaks the order of heaven and earth. These lines are metaphorical, but metaphor in ancient texts often stands atop old and literal traditions. What knowledge were the scribes warning against? What memories did they fear? One clue lies in the way Mesopotamian scholarship blended myth and science. The same scribes who copied star lists also curated myths. The same scholars who calculated eclipses copied hymns. Their world had no division between the symbolic and the empirical. To them, cosmology was not metaphor. It was a structure of reality. Thus, when they spoke of the decrees of old, they meant not merely ritual prescriptions, but the underlying order of the universe. When they spoke of the Watchers, they meant observers, priests, astronomers, record keepers. When they spoke of hidden knowledge, they meant knowledge with consequences. And the older the knowledge, the heavier the consequences seemed to become. This is most clearly seen in the Lamentations, text written after wars, floods, or the fall of cities. Over and over, the scribes describe disasters as the result of violations of the old order, the breaking of the forgotten decrees, the corruption of the ancient knowledge. But they never specify what those decrees were. They speak as though everyone already knows, or perhaps as though no one remembers clearly enough to articulate them. This ambiguity raises an unsettling possibility. The earliest Mesopotamian libraries were not meant to preserve full knowledge of the past. They were meant to preserve only what was safe, only what maintained social, cosmic, and ritual order, only what fit within the worldview that emerged after the flood. Anything older than that, anything tied to a world before kingship, before the me were divided, before cities rose, was either forgotten or deliberately left unwritten. And then there are the blank tablets. Scholars sometimes find tablet blanks in archives, slabs of clay shaped, dried, and stored, but never inscribed. Officially, these were reserves, but some appear in sequences where texts are missing. Others appear beside tablets with partially erased content. A few show traces of scrubbed incisions, writing removed before firing. Erasure was not uncommon in antiquity, but when the pattern becomes consistent, occurring specifically in sections relating to origins, cosmology, or pre-flood events, one begins to wonder what was once written there. The temple libraries of Mesopotamia were not neutral repositories. They were instruments of continuity and of control. They shaped memory not by recording everything, but by deciding what could and could not be preserved. And so, the deeper one studies these silent rooms, the clearer a strange paradox becomes. The earliest civilizations preserved vast amounts of knowledge, while allowing their deepest origins to dissolve into mist. Whether by accident, by cultural drift, or by deliberate design, humanity's earliest archivists left the first chapters unwritten. And that leads to a question that lingers like dust in the still air of those ancient rooms. If the world before the flood truly existed in some form, whether symbolic or literal, then who decided that its memory should remain only in fragments? And what were they trying to protect future generations from remembering? There is a kind of absence in the archaeological record that feels heavier than presence. An absence not created by time alone, but by a silence that seems chosen. The Ubaid people, who occupied southern Mesopotamia before the rise of Sumer, embody precisely this kind of silence. They appear suddenly without clear predecessors. They leave behind settlements, pottery, tools, figurines, and then, just as suddenly, they vanish. No collapse, no dramatic environmental shift, no invasion layer. They simply dissolve into the emergence of early Sumerian culture, as though absorbed, erased, or folded into something new. Yet within their material remains lies a strangeness that refuses to disappear. Something about them does not entirely align with the world that came after. The Ubaid period spans nearly 2,000 years, longer than many empires. Its people built some of the earliest large planned settlements in Mesopotamia. They developed irrigation systems. They produced fine pottery with consistent motifs across vast distances. Yet their society appears inexplicably uniform. Sites hundreds of kilometers apart share stylistic coherence that archaeologists struggle to explain. Cultural diffusion alone cannot account for this consistency. It implies something more, either intense contact between far-flung groups or a shared origin whose roots extend beyond the archaeological horizon. Most unsettling of all are the figurines. Found at Tel al-Ubaid, Eridu, Ur, and several other sites, these small, often crudely molded figures depict humanoid beings with elongated, tapered heads, large almond-shaped eyes, and thin bodies. Some appear female, holding infants. Others wear what look like regalia or ritual attire. Scholars caution against sensational interpretations. These figures do not prove anything extraordinary. Yet their stylistic continuity and the absence of similar forms in later Sumerian art raise questions. were these religious icons, ancestors, spirits, symbols of identity. The figurines resist interpretation because the culture that made them left no written explanations, only clay hints of a worldview that does not fully survive in Sumerian myth. The elongated skulls of the figurines echo another enigma. Cranial deformation practiced in various ancient societies, but no human remains from the Ubaid period show such deformation. If the figurines represent idealized beings, they depict something outside normal human morphology. Whether symbolic or literal, the deviation suggests an identity distinct from later Sumerians, something other, something remembered, something that vanished. And then there are the settlements. Excavations at Eridu reveal multiple levels of pre-Sumerian habitation, each displaying architectural patterns that persist into early Sumerian temple construction. This continuity hints at inheritance. Yet Ubaid religious symbols differ markedly from later Sumerian iconography. There is no clear depiction of the Anuna or major deities. Their ritual objects and offerings are simpler, quieter, almost austere. Scholars speculate that Ubaid religion focused on household or clan spirits rather than a formal pantheon. But something about the transition from Ubaid to Sumer feels abrupt. The scale of organization shifts sharply. Settlements become cities. Simple shrines become monumental temples. The figurines disappear, replaced by imagery reflecting a highly developed pantheon and cosmology. Clay tokens evolve into writing. This progression occurs over a relatively short span, far too rapid for a gradual cultural evolution. It suggests either a sudden influx of new people or a sudden shift in worldview triggered by external influence or internal upheaval. Some archaeologists argue that climate change or resource pressure drove this transformation. Others suggest migration from northern Mesopotamia or regions beyond. Yet no clear migration evidence exists. No mass graves, no signs of conflict, no widespread destruction. The Ubaid culture does not collapse. It dissolves, and in its dissolving, it leaves an impression of quiet erasure. The Ubaid people, for reasons we may never fully understand, vanish into the Sumerian world without leaving a trace in written mythology. The Sumerians never describe them. They never reference an earlier race. They never mention a people with elongated skulls or figurines. They speak only of the Anuna, the flood, the arrival of kingship, as though the Ubaid did not exist, as though the memory of them was erased intentionally, subsumed into a narrative beginning at Eridu where the Sumerians claimed civilization began. Not inherited, not absorbed, not transformed, but begun. But archaeological layers tell a different story. One of the most intriguing clues lies in the Ubaid burial record. Their graves show a puzzling uniformity. There are few grave goods, no clear stratification, no elite burials, no royal tombs. The dead are buried with quiet egalitarianism. Yet something else is missing: children. Infant burials are curiously rare in several Ubaid cemeteries. Scholars debate whether this reflects cultural practice, differential preservation, or unexcavated areas, but the absence feels odd. Large living settlements should produce child burials. Where are they? Were they buried separately? Did they undergo different rituals? Or does this silence reflect a worldview whose logic we no longer understand? Another clue emerges at Tepe-Gawra in northern Mesopotamia. Excavations revealed structures with striking architectural sophistication predating the rise of cities. Multi-room buildings, ceremonial spaces, finely carved stone objects. These features seem out of place in a pre-urban context. They suggest a level of social organization and technical understanding inconsistent with a typical narrative of development. Why does this sophistication appear so early, then vanish, then reappear later in the Sumerian period? What happened in between? It is here that some researchers begin to suspect a deeper story. A story of continuity disrupted, remembered only faintly. The Ubaids' disappearance coincides with a period of climatic volatility. Shorelines shifted, marshes expanded and contracted, the Persian Gulf basin continued to flood. If Ubaid settlements extended into now submerged regions, then much of their world may lie underwater. This would explain both their sudden appearance in the archaeological record and their sudden disappearance. A culture straddling land and water would be vulnerable to sea level rise. As the Gulf expanded, coastal or lowland communities could have been forced inland, merging with populations in the river plains. Their identity might have been absorbed, their symbols forgotten, their rituals replaced. This scenario fits neatly with the layered complexity of Eridu, where early Ubaid levels lie beneath the earliest Sumerian ones. It also aligns with geological evidence suggesting that human habitation once extended far into what is now the Gulf. If the Ubaid world was partly drowned, much of their memory may have drowned with it. Another possibility is more subtle, that the Ubaid represented a remnant of an older cultural tradition, a tradition that carried memories of a pre-flood world. Their figurines, architecture, and rituals may echo beliefs and symbols predating the climatic events that reshaped the region. The Sumerians, arriving later or rising from the fusion of displaced groups, may have adopted practical aspects of Ubaid life, while suppressing or forgetting its deeper meanings. In this sense, the Ubaid may be the last visible shadow of a lineage stretching further back into prehistory. Yet the most haunting possibility is that the Ubaid did not vanish at all. They may have been the very people who became the earliest Sumerians. Their disappearance then would be a transformation, not extinction. But if this is true, why does Ubaid symbolism vanish so completely? Why do their figurines stop appearing? Why does their art, their architecture, their worldview dissolve? What did the emergence of Sumer suppress, replace, or rewrite? The silence around these questions lingers like an echo in an empty room. The Ubaid left no texts. The Sumerians did not remember them. And yet, beneath the first cities, beneath the first temples, beneath the first written words, the Ubaid wait, mute, but present. Their absence seems less like a gap and more like a boundary, a threshold between worlds, a reminder that history begins only where memory fails. And so another question rises, slow and persistent, like a figure emerging from deep water. If the Ubaid were the last witnesses of an earlier age, what did they see? And why did their silence become the foundation of the world that followed? There is a peculiar unease that settles in when studying ancient maps, not the parchment charts of medieval sailors or the detailed atlases of classical geographers, but the older, stranger attempts to sketch the world long before anyone claims to have explored it. Maps are supposed to reflect knowledge, yet some of the earliest cartographic fragments defy the boundaries of what those cultures should have known. The Sumerians, in particular, left behind an unsettling inheritance, a handful of clay tablets and geographic descriptions that hint at a worldview far larger than the narrow river valleys they inhabited. And when these fragments are compared with later anomalous maps, the Piri race chart, the Orontius Phineus map, the Babylonian world tablet, a strange pattern appears, one that suggests the ancient world possessed glimpses of lands and shapes for which we have no clear historical explanation. The Babylonian world map, or Imago Mundi, is usually where the discussion begins. It is a small clay tablet from the 6th century BCE, depicting a circular world bordered by a salt sea. Babylon sits at the center with Assyria, Urartu, and Elam around it. Surrounding the ocean are 7 or 8 regions or islands, marked by wedge-shaped annotations whose meaning remains mysterious. Scholars translate these labels as the place where the sun is not seen, the ruined land, the land where a horned bull resides. They are vague, mythic, symbolic. Yet their placement, far beyond the known boundaries of Mesopotamian geography, suggests the memory of real places distorted by time. Mainstream scholarship treats the Imago Mundi as cosmological, not literal. But what makes the tablet so peculiar is not its symbolic structure. It is the fact that the Sumerians, centuries earlier, already referenced faraway lands with strange consistency. In lists of tribute, in mythic journeys, and in trade records, they describe regions beyond the Zagros, beyond Dilmun, beyond Magan, beyond Maluha. Some of these places align reasonably with known regions, others do not. Most tellingly, a handful of early texts reference lands where the waters freeze, where the sun is far, or where the mountains float on the sea. These descriptions are too vague to map directly, yet too specific to dismiss entirely. Then there is the enigma of Dilmun. The Sumerians describe it as the pure land, the bright land, a place where the sun rises. Archaeologists associate Dilmun with Bahrain or the eastern Arabian coast, yet Sumerian descriptions imply a land far larger than Bahrain, one with great rivers, wide plains, and abundant fresh water. Some scholars argue that Dilmun refers not to a single place, but to a fading memory of an earlier homeland, perhaps located in the now submerged landscapes of the Persian Gulf basin. If so, then the earliest Sumerian geography may preserve echoes of regions that vanished beneath rising seas long before maps could record them. This possibility becomes more intriguing when set beside other cartographic anomalies. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 CE, famously depicts parts of South America with surprising accuracy, and possibly shows an ice-free Antarctic coastline. Scholars debate whether these features are real, misinterpreted, or coincidental. Yet Piri Reis himself claimed he used ancient maps as sources, some allegedly thousands of years old. His comment is often dismissed, but it raises a question. Why did Renaissance cartographers believe older maps existed beyond those known in historical record? The Orontes Phineas map of 1531 intensifies this puzzle. It depicts Antarctica's general outline with striking resemblance to the continent's true shape under ice, something unknown until modern surveys. Supporters of alternative theories argue that these maps reflect remnants of ancient geographic knowledge. Critics attribute the accuracy to guesswork or projection errors. Yet the strange consistency persists. Certain features appear on several Renaissance maps that claim ancient origins, but have no surviving originals. When confronted with such anomalies, most historians point to medieval misinterpretations, scrapal copying errors, or creative embellishments. But beneath these explanations lies a simpler, more grounded question. Where did early civilizations, Sumer, Babylon, even Egypt, get their concepts of distant regions they never explored? The answer may lie partly in trade networks. Mesopotamia imported lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, gold from Anatolia, timber from the Levant. These exchanges carried stories. Yet trade alone cannot explain the Sumerian insistence on lands so distant and so conceptually strange that they appear more imagined than remembered. One scholar, Samuel Noah Kramer, noted that certain Sumerian myths refer to lands beyond the known world not as fantasies, but as places known to the ancients. He was cautious in interpreting this phrase, but its implications are hard to ignore. Who were these ancients? What world did they know? Some researchers propose that Sumer inherited geographic memory through oral traditions stretching back to the late Pleistocene. Hunter-gatherer groups could have carried stories of landscapes now submerged or reshaped. When these memories filtered into organized culture, they might have been preserved symbolically in myth and ritual. Yet the specificity in some descriptions suggests more than mythic drift. For instance, a Sumerian myth describes a distant land of black cliffs where the rivers fall into the sea, reminiscent of certain African or Indian Ocean coastlines. Another mentions a region where the sun lingers long in the sky, suggestive of high-latitude environments. Another describes the land of long shadows, where the cold bites like a living thing. These may be poetic, yet such imagery feels foreign to the Mesopotamian environment. If not literal, then where did these motifs originate? Some scholars propose a simpler explanation. Sumerian priests incorporated cosmological directions, east, west, north, south, into geographic myth, but this fails to explain the geographic specificity found in early trade texts that mention exotic goods from lands that cannot be fully identified today. Lands described with contextual detail inconsistent with pure symbolism. There is a possibility that sits uncomfortable in the middle ground between myth and archaeology. What if early civilizations preserved fragments of geographic knowledge that originated before the great post-Ice Age floods? If groups lived along coastlines now drowned beneath the Arabian Sea, the Gulf, or the Indian Ocean, their mental maps of the world would differ significantly from those of the Bronze Age. If their descendants migrated inland after sea level rise destroyed their homelands, they might have carried those memories with them. Over time, these recollections would blur, becoming mythic but retaining certain consistent elements. Such a theory gains subtle support from geological studies. Bathymetric surveys reveal ancient river channels beneath the Persian Gulf, rivers that once fed a lush basin capable of supporting large populations. Undersea topography shows plains, deltas, and potential settlement sites. If people lived in this region before it flooded around 6000 to 5000 BCE, their knowledge of the broader world, its coastlines, its horizons, its far-off regions, would reflect landscapes that no longer exist. In that sense, the earliest Sumerian references to foreign lands could be memories of a pre-flood geography. Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha might originally have denoted regions that shifted or vanished as seas rose. The regions beyond the circle of the ocean in the Babylonian map could be symbolic echoes of real places, distorted by the collapse of ancient migration routes and coastal settlements. And if this is true, if the earliest world maps preserve the ghost outlines of submerged continents or forgotten coasts, then the Sumerians may have inherited a cartographic memory far older than writing itself. The mystery deepens further when considering the silence of early libraries about pre-flood geography. It is as though the scribes recognized traces of a world older than their own, but lacked the context to interpret it. So they encoded those traces as myth, as cosmology, as symbolic geography, not realizing that beneath the symbols lay the fading outlines of real landscapes. And so, one is left with a quiet question that seems to hover at the edge of every broken tablet, every incomplete map, every mythic description of faraway lands. If ancient maps contain the faint memory of a world erased, then what coastlines, what mountains, what rivers, what civilizations did the first people know that we no longer see on any map today? There is a quiet unease that seeps through the oldest Mesopotamian texts whenever they speak of figures who stand somewhere between mortal and divine. Those liminal beings who are neither gods nor men, yet whose names appear again and again in the early chronologies. Later traditions would call them heroes. Some scholars call them demigods, but the oldest tablets use a different phrase, one that feels both literal and symbolic: the priest kings. They are figures who appear as custodians of knowledge, bearers of rituals, guardians of decrees. Their stories, though fragmented, carry an air of antiquity that suggests they did not arise within Sumerian culture, but were inherited from something older. The most enigmatic among them is Enmedurenki, the king of Sippar. In later Babylonian texts, he is portrayed not simply as a ruler, but as the one chosen by the gods to receive the tablet of the heavens on the netherworld. He's taught how to observe the stars, read omens, interpret smoke, understand the winds, skills that define the priestly lineage of the Baru, the diviners who guided Mesopotamian kings for millennia. Scholars see Enmedurenki as a mythic prototype for the learned sage, linking the priesthood to a divine source of knowledge. But the tone of the earliest texts is strange. They do not describe him as a god-made man. They describe him as someone who remembers what others forget. The parallels with Enoch from the Hebrew tradition are hard to ignore. Both are taken up by heavenly beings, Both are taught cosmic secrets. Both become intermediaries between the divine realm and humanity. Both anchor genealogies of knowledge, astronomy, divination, calendrics. Comparative scholars have long discussed these similarities, but what receives less attention is the implication that both figures represent a shared memory. The idea that, before the flood, there existed a class of individuals entrusted with preserving the structure of the cosmos. These priest-kings, whether historical figures, mythic projections, or distorted memories, appear across early cultures. Egypt had its followers of Horus, the mysterious pre-dynastic rulers credited with establishing the foundations of the kingdom. India had its rishis, semi-divine sages who preserved sacred knowledge across cosmic cycles. The Andes had its white-robed teachers who emerged from Lake Titicaca to instruct humanity. Even the first kings of China, like Fuxi and Shennong, are portrayed not as conquerors, but as transmitters of knowledge, agriculture, medicine, calendar, writing. It is tempting to see these parallels as mere archetypes, cultural expressions of the human desire for a wise progenitor. But the consistency of the pattern suggests something deeper. Many ancient cultures preserved the idea that knowledge did not arise gradually, but was handed down by a select group, often described as both human and more than human. In Sumer, these figures sit quietly in the background, overshadowed by the more colorful gods, yet their function is unmistakable. They are the links between worlds, and Enmedrankhi is not alone. The Sumerian king list contains several enigmatic rulers whose names carry the weight of myth. Alulimma, the first king of Eridu, is described as shepherd of the people, a title later used for priests. Dumuzi, the shepherd, another early king, becomes mythologized as the dying god Tammuz. Ziusudra, the flood survivor, becomes the conduit through which pre-flood knowledge passes into the post-flood world. These figures are not warriors or empire builders. They are interpreters, mediators, carriers of tradition. What links them is not power, but memory. And memory, in the ancient world, was the deepest form of authority. One of the more puzzling features of the early priest kings is their connection to writing, or, perhaps more accurately, to pre-writing. Before cuneiform developed into a writing system, Mesopotamia used token systems and symbolic objects to track goods and rituals. Some scholars believe these tokens were tied to priestly lineages, responsible for maintaining economic and religious order. But certain symbols appear not to represent transactions at all. They appear to encode cosmological ideas, cycles of the moon, solstitial markers, numerological systems. The continuity between these symbols and later cuneiform suggests that the earliest scribes were not inventors, but inheritors, formalizing an older symbolic language that had begun to fray. If this older system belonged to the priest-kings, then writing may have emerged not to create knowledge but to preserve what was already slipping away. Another clue lies in the geographic orientation of early temples. Many of the first sacred structures are aligned with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the heliacal rising of key stars. This is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which the governance of society and the governance of the cosmos were inseparable. The priest-king was not simply a ruler. He was the axis around which heaven and earth were coordinated. His authority derived not from conquest but from harmony with the celestial order. Yet something happens after the flood. The priest-kings diminish, their lifespans shorten. Their powers become symbolic rather than literal. In the king list, the transition is abrupt. After the flood, rulers live for centuries instead of millennia. After a few generations, for decades. It is as though the world's connection to the primordial order weakened. Some scholars interpret this as mythic compression. Others see it as a reflection of social transformation. The rise of secular kingship, the decline of ritual authority, the fragmentation of knowledge. But there is another, more haunting possibility, that the Sumerians were remembering a real rupture in cultural continuity, a break in transmission. If the pre-flood world preserved a lineage of specialized knowledge holders, the flood would have disrupted that lineage. Survivors would have carried fragments, not the whole. Their descendants would have tried to rebuild, but the world they rebuilt lacked the coherence of the one before. This interpretation gains weight when one examines the genealogies of the Apkarlu, semi-divine sages associated with each pre-flood king. After the flood, the Apkarlu are replaced by humans described as born of women, implying a loss of divine or semi-divine inheritance. The Apkarlu are depicted as fish-cloaked figures, often associated with water, knowledge, and creation. Their withdrawal after the flood is significant. It marks the end of a world where cosmic and human realms were closely aligned. In this sense, the priest kings are the last embers of a forgotten fire. Yet even in their diminished form, they leave traces across the ancient world. The Sumerian scribes describe certain kings as those who rebuilt the foundations, those who restored the measures, those who remembered the old ways. These are not military achievements. They are acts of preservation, attempts to reconstruct a world whose original blueprint had been damaged. That blueprint appears subtly in later mathematical and astronomical systems. The sexagesimal, base 60 counting method, the sophisticated lunar calendar, the division of the sky into 3 pathways, all of these systems are too refined to have emerged suddenly, yet they appear fully formed in the early record. The priest kings perhaps were the ones who held these systems before writing stabilized them. One detail often overlooked is that the early rulers of cities like Kish, Uruk, and Nippur are described as performing rituals of measuring the foundations of the world. This is usually interpreted as temple building, but the language is older than architecture. It likely refers to measuring time, cycles, and cosmic order. Geometry, in the ancient world, was cosmology. If the priest kings held this knowledge, their silence in later text is not accidental. As new political powers emerged, as city-states competed, as empires rose and fell, the role of the priest-king fragmented. Kings became warriors, priests became bureaucrats. The old lineage, one that carried cosmic knowledge, faded into myth. And Meduranki became a legend. Dumuzid became a god. Ziusudra became a memory. And yet, beneath the myths, their silhouettes remain. They stand at the threshold of history like shadows cast by a fading light, neither fully remembered nor fully forgotten. Their presence is a reminder that the earliest civilizations did not see themselves as the beginning of human knowledge, but as the inheritors of something older. And that leads to a question that grows more pressing with each fragment studied, each inscription translated, each myth reinterpreted. If the priest kings were the last custodians of a forgotten tradition, then what world, what age, what catastrophe, what cycle forced them to guard knowledge so fiercely that even their names dissolve into ambiguity the moment we try to grasp them? There is a point in the Sumerian narrative where all the fragments, flood myths, king lists, forbidden tablets, vanished cultures, wandering priest kings begin to bend toward one another like iron filings drawn to an unseen magnet. The myths grow darker, the timelines grow stranger, the tone in the tablets becomes heavy, almost mournful, as though the scribes themselves sensed a shadow behind the stories they were copying. This shadow is not a single event, nor a single figure, nor even a single age. It is something more subtle, the sense that the Sumerians were trying to warn someone, perhaps themselves, perhaps us, about a pattern repeating across time, a cycle of rising knowledge, sudden erasure and cautious rebuilding. And in their oldest texts, this warning does not announce itself loudly. It whispers, buried between lines, buried beneath centuries, buried alongside truths no one dared to state plainly. You feel this most strongly in the strange vocabulary the Sumerians used to describe the world before the flood. They never call it a golden age. They never describe it as peaceful or perfect. Instead, they speak of its enormity, its weight, its density of knowledge and lifespan and memory. It is a world too large for the post-flood mind to comprehend. The antediluvian kings live impossibly long lives, not out of fantasy but out of scale. Their reigns read like metaphors stretched across continents. Their deeds are almost too quiet for myth, assigning territories, measuring foundations, guarding decrees. These are not the tasks of gods. They are the tasks of custodians, caretakers of an order that must be maintained with precision, or else collapse. Collapse it did. The flood in Sumerian literature is not just a meteorological catastrophe. It is a purging of knowledge, a severing of continuity. Whenever the texts describe the flood, they emphasize not the destruction of people, but the breaking of me, the cosmic decrees that structure reality. Something about those decrees becomes dangerous, uncontrollable, or perhaps misused. Some scholars interpret this as moral allegory, others as symbolic cosmology. But the tone in the oldest fragments feels too anxious for allegory, too technical for metaphor. The flood is a reset, and the Sumerians hint repeatedly that it was not the first. What makes this even stranger is how consistently the Sumerians speak of restoring rather than creating. After the flood, kingship is lowered again. Laws are given back. Cities are rebuilt. Time itself is renewed. These verbs portray a worldview in which the world is periodically dismantled and reassembled, each time losing something, each time forgetting something, each time becoming smaller or dimmer than before. This cyclic framework appears not only in Sumerian myth, but echoes in distant traditions. The Indian concept of yugas describes ages of decreasing wisdom. Greek myths speak of successive races, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each further from divine memory. Egypt's king lists include rulers before the time of Horus, whose origins dissolve into shadow. Mesoamerican civilizations recount suns that rose and fell, each destroyed and remade. These parallels do not prove anything literal, but they reveal a shared intuition that history is not linear, that memory is fragile, that something once known slipped through humanity's fingers long before writing began. But what exactly was lost? The Sumerians offer clues, though they speak in fragments. They describe decrees too powerful for men, arts sealed to prevent misuse, laws whose utterance shakes the world. The language is symbolic, but its consistency is unsettling. Something was fragmenting, something was withdrawn, something that had once been available became forbidden. The tablets hint at three possibilities. 1. Knowledge. Not simple knowledge of farming or metallurgy, but something structural, cosmological, mathematical, organizational. The kind of knowledge that allowed the earliest cities to emerge with suspicious suddenness. Knowledge that later civilizations preserved imperfectly, sometimes ritualized, sometimes misunderstood. The sexagesimal system, the lunar calendar, sacred geometry, architectural templates. These may be the quiet descendants of something older. 2. Memory. The sense that humanity once carried a more coherent understanding of its place in the world. The early Sumerian scribes described their work as restoring remembrance. They feared forgetting. They feared the dissolution of knowledge through time. Some even write of the day when no one will remember the names of the old ones. These lines are not myth, they are anxiety. 3. Lineage. The priest kings, the Apkallu, the Watchers, figures who preserved order and knowledge across ages. After the flood, their successors are mortal, fallible, less connected to the cosmic order. Something about their lineage breaks. Their wisdom becomes ritual. Their function becomes symbolic. The chain of transmission weakens. Each possibility alone is intriguing. Together they form a warning. This warning grows clearer when one examines the later editing of Sumerian texts. Across the Old Babylonian period, roughly the time when scribes copied the most ancient myths, several fragments appear with erased lines, altered phrases, substituted names. Some of these edits are political, but others are harder to explain. Lines referencing the old laws before the waters are sometimes scratched out. References to those who came before the first cities vanish. Mentions of the watchers who measured the heavens before kingship fade. It is as though the scribes were told to omit something, not because it was untrue, but because the world had changed. The priesthoods of the later ages inherited fragments, but no longer understood their context, so they reshaped the myths to fit their own cosmology, sealing away meanings that no longer made sense. But the edges of the oldest story remain visible. The flood in Sumerian thought is the dividing line between comprehension and confusion. Before it, the world is ordered. After it, the world is improvised. Before it, cycles are perfect. After it, they drift. Before it, knowledge is continuous. After it, it is scattered. The Sumerian warning emerges from this contrast. It is not a prophecy. It is a memory, a recognition that the loss of a world does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, through forgetting, through erosion, through the fraying of systems once held together by something more coherent than human institutions. And perhaps it is also a pattern, because when the Sumerians describe the flood as a response to human noise, scholars usually interpret noise as chaos, sin, or crowding. But some linguists argue that noise means something else, the breakdown of order, the loss of harmony between human society and the cosmic structure. The world before the flood may not have fallen because of human wickedness, but because the delicate alignment that held it together, astronomical, ritual, political, spiritual, began to fail. In that sense, the flood is not punishment. It is reset, a forced recalibration when the system becomes unstable. And if this is true, then the Sumerian warning becomes sharper. Civilization is not guaranteed. Knowledge is not permanent. Memory is not safe. Even the tallest cigarettes can vanish beneath mud and time. The Sumerians seem to whisper this through every cracked tablet, every repeated myth, every reconstructed lineage of kings. Pay attention. Stories of origins are never complete. Every age believes itself secure until the cycle turns. Every civilization assumes its knowledge will endure until it doesn't. And so the question hangs in the air, quiet and cold, like the stillness before a storm. If the flood was not the end of an ancient world but the consequence of forgetting, then what happens when forgetting begins again, and we do not notice the cycle repeating beneath our feet? There is a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, when a long journey through ancient memory turns inward. After wandering through ruined cities, fractured tablets, lost maps, silent libraries, vanished peoples, and faintly remembered priest kings, one begins to sense that the real mystery is not only what the Sumerians remembered, but what they wanted to leave behind. The oldest civilizations often speak in the language of stone and clay, but beneath those materials lies something softer, more fragile, and infinitely more human. The ache of forgetting. The sense that something important slipped away in the deep past, and that each generation is left holding only a handful of fragments, trying desperately to understand a story whose beginning has been washed clean. The final layer of the Sumerian worldview feels different from the layers before. It is quieter, more reflective, less concerned with divine drama, and more concerned with the slow unraveling of memory. In the hymns and myths, their genealogies and lamentations, the Sumerians return again and again to the same motif. Humanity is a species living in the aftermath of an event it cannot fully remember, guided by knowledge it no longer completely understands. Their civilization begins, not with triumph, but with a wound, an invisible scar running through the fabric of their origin stories. And it is this wound, more than any flood or lost king or shadowy lineage, that shapes the final tone of their narrative. One of the most haunting Sumerian lines appears in a short, damaged tablet from Nippur. It reads, "We are those who walk in the ruins of the old ones." The line is often interpreted metaphorically, but it carries a strange literal resonance. The earliest Sumerian cities rose on top of earlier settlements, Eridu built upon Ubaid layers, Uruk upon proto-urban clusters, every temple rebuilt on the ruins of an older temple. Even their myths echo this palimpsest. They describe their laws, their rituals, their architecture as restorations, not innovations. It is as though they believe themselves to be the last echo of something much older, something that left traces not only in the ground but in the human mind. What is remarkable is how consistently the Sumerians acknowledged their own incompleteness. Their scribes spoke often of the words that were lost, the days whose records are broken, the rites whose meaning has faded. Even in their confidence, their dazzling achievements in mathematics, astronomy, law, they carried the awareness that their knowledge was partial. They measured the heavens with astonishing precision, yet insisted that the old watchers had known more. They built cities that shaped the future of civilization, yet claimed that their first temple was only a rebuilt fragment of a forgotten original. They created writing, yet believed they were capturing only shadows of truths once spoken but now beyond reach. This sense of standing at the edge of a lost world permeates their final cultural expressions. In their lamentations over destroyed cities, they sometimes slip into a tone that feels older than the destruction being described. They mourn not only for Ur or Nippur or Lagash, but for something deeper, the order that once was, the harmony that bound the heavens, the memory that cannot be summoned. It is as if every catastrophe, every war, every famine echoed an earlier fall that none could fully articulate. Even their theology shifts subtly in later eras. The gods become more distant. The Anuna fade from the world stage, retreating into ritual rather than action. The Upkalu appear only in mythic memory. Kingship becomes political rather than cosmic. Knowledge becomes bureaucratic rather than sacred. The world feels dimmer, smaller, less connected to the deep rhythms of the sky. Something that once linked humanity to the cosmic order has frayed, and the Sumerians seem painfully aware of it. A late Babylonian scribe, copying an ancient text about the flood, adds a short commentary in the margin. We do not know what came before. The fathers of old knew, but their knowledge was lost when the worlds changed. This marginal note, rarely discussed in popular accounts, captures the essence of the Sumerian warning more clearly than any myth. It is not a threat. It is not a prophecy. It is a remembrance of loss, a recognition that civilizations do not collapse only when their walls fall, they collapse when their memory breaks. And yet the Sumerians never expressed despair. Instead, they treated memory, however fragmented, as something to be tended, guarded, carried forward. They copied tablets they barely understood. They rebuilt temples whose original designs were forgotten. They preserved star cycles whose meanings had shifted. They cataloged rituals inherited from vanished peoples. They kept alive stories of kings whose reigns defied reason. They treated every shard of memory, no matter how small, as sacred. Perhaps this is the deepest part of the Sumerian warning, that remembering is not about recovering a perfect, unbroken past. It is about refusing to let the past disappear entirely. Standing at the edge of their world, the Sumerians seem to sense that human knowledge moves in cycles, expansion followed by contraction, discovery followed by forgetting. They viewed their origins through the lens of a catastrophic break, but they also understood that the act of rebuilding, of piecing together what survived, is itself a form of continuity. Even when knowledge is incomplete, even when countless chapters are missing, something persists in the fragments, a rhythm, a pattern, a whisper of the world that came before. This whisper lingers across the centuries, carried not only through clay tablets but through the structures of thought the Sumerians left behind. The calendar that still shapes our timekeeping, the numerical system embedded in degrees and hours, the cosmological frameworks echoed in later religions, the literary motifs that appear in epics across the ancient world. Their memory did not survive intact, but it survived enough to shape everything that followed. And maybe that is the real heart of their warning. Not that a great civilization was lost, but that such loss is always possible, that forgetting is always waiting at the edges, that humanity must actively tend its memory or risk watching it dissolve into silence once more. They had lived through one erasure and feared another. They wrote, built, observed, measured, and above all remembered to guard against a second fall. So the final question the Sumerians leave us is not about the past, it is about the future. They seem to ask, what do you do when you realize that your world too is built upon forgotten foundations? What do you do when you sense that knowledge can slip away as easily as clay tablets crumble? What do you do when you stand at the edge of your own age, knowing how fragile civilizations truly are? Their answer, offered not through command but through example, is simple. You remember what you can. You carry forward whatever fragments survive. You rebuild with care. You remain aware of the cycles that shape human history, and you listen for the quiet echoes beneath your feet, for the faint patterns written in the sky, for the whispers preserved in stories older than any city. And perhaps that is all any civilization can do. Hold the memory gently, protect it from erasure, and pass it on before the next flood, literal or metaphorical, arrives. In the end, the Sumerian warning is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is a whisper traveling across millennia, asking each new age the same quiet, unsettling question. When the foundations of your world begin to tremble, will you notice the forgetting? Or will you only recognize it after the waters have already risen?